The manifest was 4 pages long. I remember counting the pages. A habit from before the occupation, when paperwork still meant something human. 4 pages, single-spaced, in the Vethara's preferred font. A clean serif that looked almost like Helvetica if you didn't look too closely. Which was exactly the kind of almost that described everything the Vethara did. They had studied us long enough to know what made us calm, and they deployed that knowledge the way you'd deploy a sedative gas. Not to help you, but to make you easier to manage. I was sitting across a processing counter from a Vethara clerk named Osivith 14. That was the whole name, Osivith 14. Not a number added to a name. The number was load-bearing. Osivith was the designation cluster, and 14 was the position within that cluster, the way you'd say third chair or second shift. When I asked early on what I should call him, he'd tilted his head at an angle that I'd come to understand meant the question contained an error. "You call me by my designation," he'd said. "That is what it is for." The Vethara Processing Annex sat on what used to be the 3rd floor of the old municipal building on Heron Street. They'd gutted the interior, taken out the drop ceilings, the cubicle partitions, the water-stained acoustic tiles, and replaced it all with their preferred aesthetic, which was a kind of aggressive cleanliness. Pale gray composite panels on every wall. Long counters of the same material, slightly darker so you could find the surface. Terminals recessed into those counters. Their screens angled precisely 12 degrees toward the person standing on the other side, never toward the clerk. Overhead, a row of tall glass panels had been installed where the old suspended ceiling used to be, and midday light came down through them in even unbroken columns. No shadows worth mentioning. The Vethara didn't like shadows. Not for any mystical reason. They simply found them inefficient, visually speaking. Every surface you couldn't see clearly was a surface that required additional processing time to classify. I'd been standing at that counter for 40 minutes before Osivith 14 even acknowledged I was there. Not rudeness. It wasn't in their nature to be rude the way we understand it. He was completing a prior task. He completed tasks in sequence, and introducing a new variable before the prior task was closed was not something his classification architecture permitted. I stood. The light came down in columns. Somewhere behind me, through a glass partition, I could hear the rest of my squad. All 22 of them, sitting on the bench seats the Vethara had provided, also waiting, also in sequence. Shh. When he finally looked up, Osivith 14 looked at me the way they all looked at us. A kind of clinical attention that never quite resolved into recognition. Not hostility. Not contempt. Something more unsettling than either of those. Pure cataloging. He was reading me the way a scanner reads a barcode, and I'd learned to let it happen. The ones who tensed up, who met that look with their jaws set and their hands tight, tended to generate what the Vethara called discrepancy flags. A discrepancy flag meant your file had to be reviewed by a higher-tier classifier, which added 6 to 8 hours to any processing event, which meant another 6 to 8 hours in the holding corridor. I'd learned to be boring. "Sergeant Mara Osi," I said. "Identification number 774 Echo Donide 1. Transfer group, Heron 7, 23 personnel including myself." He was already typing before I finished. That was one thing about the Vethara, their data entry was extraordinary. Not fast, exactly. Precise in a way that made fast look clumsy. Every keystroke was deliberate. Every field was filled correctly the first time. I'd watched Osivith 14 process 47 transfers in a single morning session, and not one of them had required a correction. He slid the manifest across the counter. 4 pages. The Vethara seal at the top, a symbol that looked vaguely like a closed eye, which I was fairly sure was coincidental, but I'd stopped being sure about things like that. Every name in my squad printed in their clean font, each line containing surname, given name, identification number, rank classification, physical condition rating, skill cluster designation, a field labeled secondary notation, which was for every single person, blank. I was supposed to read it, confirm it was accurate, and sign at the bottom of page 4. I read it, it was accurate. 22 names I had memorized in a different order than the Vethara used. I knew them by bunk position, by the sound of their footsteps, by which ones snored, and which ones ticked in their sleep, and which ones woke up angry and ones woke up already somewhere else in their heads. already at distance from wherever we'd been. The Vithara had them sorted by identification number, ascending. I read down the list and matched each number to a face. It was my own small act of defiance, the kind that generated no flags. I got to line 19, Chalk Darren Augustine, 881 Foxtrot 447. First class, physical condition, 3.2, within transfer parameters, skill cluster, general infantry, secondary load bearing, secondary notation, blank. I stopped. I don't know why I did it. I've thought about it since, many times, and I still don't have a clean answer. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't even a conscious decision in the way that decisions usually feel, the little moment of deliberation, the small interior voice that says yes or no. It was more like a reflex. The way your hand moves to catch something falling before your brain has decided to catch it. I took the pen they'd provided. A Vithara stylus, smooth and slightly too light, the kind of instrument that felt designed to make your signature look smaller than it really was. And in the secondary notation field next to Chalk Darren Augustine, I wrote one word, Songbird. Then I kept reading. Got to the bottom of page 4, signed. Osivith 14 took the manifest back, set it on the scanner plate, and waited. The Vithara processing terminals had a particular sound when they completed a scan. A clean, low tone, almost a chime, that indicated full acceptance. I'd heard it 47 times that morning, once for each of the transfers he'd processed before me. Brief and final, like a door closing softly. I didn't hear it. What I heard instead was nothing. The terminal cycled through its usual sequence. I could see the progress indicator moving across his screen, and then the indicator stopped, and the screen shifted to a color I hadn't seen before. Not red. The Vithara didn't use red for anything, as far as I could tell. It was more of a deep amber, the color of old resin, and it sat in the upper right quadrant of his screen, with a patience that felt almost personal. Osivith 14 looked at the screen. He looked at the manifest, he looked at me. There is an unresolved entry, he said. I know, I said. The secondary notation field for entry 19 contains a character string that does not correspond to any registered classification. I know that too, I said. He tilted his head. Not the error tilt this time. A different angle, the one I'd come to understand as recalibration. He was adjusting his approach. The field must contain a valid classification or remain blank, he said. An unrecognized string in a mandatory review field cannot be accepted by the system. I looked at him. Then I looked at the amber glow on his screen. The field was blank when you gave it to me, I said. There was no instruction that said it had to remain blank. He was quiet for a moment. The Vithara did that. Went quiet when they encountered something that required rerouting. Not uncomfortable silence. Not hesitation in the human sense. More like a gear disengaging to find a different gear. The field's blank state indicated no secondary notation was applicable, he said. If you have entered a notation, it must conform to the registered classification schema. Please identify the classification category to which the notation Songbird belongs. I thought about it. I thought about Darren Chalk, who was 19 years old, and had been with my squad for 8 months and had a habit, not irritating, never irritating, just present, of humming. Not songs you could identify mostly. Little melodic shapes he made while he was doing repetitive work. Cleaning his rifle, which he did with an attention that was almost devotional. Rolling his kit. Eating. The hum would start without him noticing it started, and it would stop the same way. In between there was this thread of sound that ran through whatever we were doing like a seam, quiet and continuous. Corporal Yennefer Adazi had named it first, had said it without thinking one morning, when Chalk was cleaning his rifle, and the hum was going, and Adazi said, without looking up from her own kit, God, Songbird, do you ever stop? And Chalk had looked up and said, what? And Adazi had said, nothing. Keep going. And from that point forward, in the informal ledger that squads keep in their heads, he was Songbird. It doesn't belong to a category, I said. It's a name. A name, Osivith 14 said. He said it the way you'd repeat a word from a foreign language. Carefully, making sure you had the syllables right. A nickname, I said. Something his squadmates call him. Called him. What we called him. He looked at the manifest again. Entry 19 was highlighted on his screen, I could see, in the amber that meant unresolved. The registered name field for entry 19 is correctly populated, he said. Chalk Darren Augustine, Secondary notation field is not a name field. It is a classification field. If you wish to add a supplementary name or alias designation, that must be entered through the registered alias protocol, which requires a separate form, Annex D7, filed at least 72 hours prior to any transfer event. I didn't file an Annex D7, I said. No, he said, you did not. We looked at each other across the counter. Behind me, through the glass partition, I could hear the ambient sounds of 22 people sitting, the small adjustments of weight on bench seats. Someone coughing once, someone else shifting a boot on the floor. Those sounds were very specific to me. I knew whose cough that was. I knew whose boot. So what happens now, I said. Transfer cannot be processed in its current state. Osith 14 said. The unresolved entry creates a classification gap that must be resolved before the manifest can be closed. I will need to escalate to a Tier 2 classification authority for guidance on handling an unrecognized notation in a transfer document. How long does that take, I said. He typed something. Looked at a secondary screen I couldn't see. Tier 2 response time for classification queries is currently 4 to 6 standard hours, he said. You and your group will be held in the waiting facility during that period. He said it without apology, without satisfaction, without anything I could read as human. It was simply the information. The transfer had a gap. The gap required a higher tier. The waiting facility was where people waited. These were facts in sequence. I said, fine. Because what else do you say? They put us in a room on the second floor. Not a cell. I want to be careful about the word. Because calling it a cell would imply a level of intent on the Vethara's part that wasn't quite accurate. It was a waiting room. It had bench seating along 3 walls, the same gray composite as everything else, and a single window that looked out over the old parking structure to the east. Now repurposed as a vehicle staging area for Vethara logistics convoys, the window had no blind or screen. The midday sun came in at an angle and laid a bright square on the floor that moved slowly as the afternoon went on. There was a water in one corner. There was nothing else. I went to the window and looked out at the staging area and thought about Darren, Chalk. He was down there somewhere, in the queue of people who'd already been separated from our group and taken to a different waiting room. Vethara ran gender-separated holding by default, another one of their almost human administrative choices. I couldn't see him. I could see the bright flat roof of the parking structure and the orderly rows of Vethara logistics vehicles and the small figures of Vethara administrators moving between them with the particular economical stride that meant they were on task and in sequence. Every one of them moved the same way. Not identically, because they were individuals, but with the same underlying rhythm, the rhythm of people who knew exactly where they were going and why, which was a quality I'd once associated with the military, and now associated with something more unsettling, something that had more to do with the absence of doubt than with the presence of purpose. I thought about the word I'd written, Songbird. In my handwriting, which is not elegant, I never had elegant handwriting. I have the handwriting of someone who learned to write quickly in margins and logbooks, in the pre-dawn and the post-adrenaline, when your hand is moving faster than your deliberation. The word would have looked slightly crowded in the notation field, slightly uneven, slightly too alive for the Vethara's clean font. Their font was the typographic equivalent of the building we were in, designed to be read quickly and without ambiguity, every character taking up exactly the space it needed, no more. My handwriting took up whatever space it felt like taking. I hadn't done it to cause trouble, or, that's not quite right, I'd done it without thinking, which meant I'd done it out of something more basic than strategy, of the same impulse that made Adiezi say it the first time, that made every squad member who followed her pick it up and use it, the human need to name things in the way they are, not in the way a form demands them to be. Darren Chalk was not only 881 Foxtrot 447, First Class, General Infantry, Secondary Load-Bearing, he was also Songbird. Both things were true. Both things were his. The Vethara had a field for one and not the other, and I had, without planning it, put the other one in the field where it didn't belong. I'd been thinking about the Vethara's record-keeping since the early weeks of the occupation, when I'd first understood what it was they actually did. Not just cataloging, though cataloging was the visible part, The forms, the terminals, the manifest signatures, processing counters, and their amber flags. What they were actually doing was something more foundational than that. They were building a complete model of everything they administered. Every person under their authority had a record. Every resource had a record. Every transaction, every movement, every event had a record. And all of those records were connected. If you changed one thing in one record, the connected records updated to reflect it. It was, from a certain angle, almost beautiful. Civilization that had taken the human impulse to document and carried it all the way to its logical endpoint, past paperwork and into something more like a map of the world. A continuous real-time representation of everything that was happening and had happened. The problem with a map that complete was the same problem with any map. The territory was always slightly different from the representation. The map said roads. The territory had potholes. The map said clear field. The territory had a ditch you couldn't see until you were in it. Their records were extraordinarily accurate about everything they could measure and classify. They were, by design, silent about everything they couldn't. And the gap between those two things, between the measurable and the unclassifiable, was where we lived. Not heroically, not by plan. Just because we were people, and people were always slightly more than their documentation. Corporal Adaisy found me at the window. She had the gift of moving quietly, which I'd appreciated in the field and appreciated here. "What did you do?" she said, not accusingly, just reading the situation. "I signed the manifest," I said. She was quiet. "What's on the manifest?" she said. I told her. She was quiet for longer this time. Then she said, "You wrote it in the official notation field." "Yes." "On a thorough transfer document." "Yes." She looked out the window at the staging area for a moment. "Is that going to be a problem?" she said. "I don't know yet," I said. "Could be nothing. Be 6 hours." She nodded slowly. She had the same ability I had. The one you develop in long occupations, of receiving information about potential catastrophe with the same register you'd use for information about the weather. Not numbness, just calibration, the capacity to stay level while you figured out what you actually knew versus what you were afraid of. The 6 hours turned into something else. It started at the 4-hour mark, when Osavith 14 came to the waiting room door with a second Vithara I hadn't seen before. This one wore a collar insignia that indicated Tier 2 classification authority. A small clasp that looked like an angular bracket, which I'd been told denoted senior administrative standing. His designation was Pethavar 7. Pethavar 7 was taller than Osavith 14 and had the look of a Vithara who had not often been in a room with humans and was consciously managing that fact. The way he held his hands, flat against his sides, slightly away from his body, was the Vithara equivalent of keeping your distance. He had the manifest. He held it with both hands, the way you'd hold evidence. "Sergeant Osi," he said, "I need to understand the notation on entry 19. I explained it the same way I'd explained it to Osavith 14. A nickname. A word the squad used for Private Chalk because of a habit he had. Not an official designation, not a classification. A name between soldiers." F-7 listened. He had a quality that Osavith 14 lacked, which was the appearance of actually processing what you said, rather than simply waiting for you to finish us. He looked at me while I spoke. He looked at the manifest after. This word has Songbird. It refers to a living organism, a classification of avian species characterized by vocalization. Technically, yes, I said. But you are applying it to a human, he said. Yes, because the human produces vocal sounds. Yes. Well, not singing. Humming, Pethavar 7 said. He repeated the word with the same careful quality that Osavith 14 had repeated name, like a sound he was testing in his mouth to see if it held any additional data. He vocally produces a tone while performing repetitive tasks, I said. Not words, a kind of musical non-verbal sound. It's habitual, it's quiet. His squadmates found it identifiable, so they gave him a name for it. Pethavar 7 looked at the manifest again. He looked at entry 19 specifically, and I could see him reading the official fields, the name, the number, the rank classification, the physical condition rating, the skill cluster, and then looking at the word in the notation column, which sat among all of that official data the way a pebble sits in a very clean room. "This notation does not affect his classification," he said. It does not alter any of the registered fields. No, I said, it doesn't. It conveys information of a social or relational nature that is not material. Transfer. That's right, I said. Then I cannot understand why it was entered, he said. If information is not material to the transfer, it should not appear on the transfer document. The document is a record of material facts. I put it there because he's Songbird, I said. Because that's who he is to us. The official fields are all correct. They just don't contain everything. Pethiver 7 looked at me for a long moment. A record, he said, contains everything that is classifiable. If the information cannot be classified, it should not be in the record. I looked back at him and didn't say anything. He left with the manifest. Osivith 14 followed him. The door closed with the soft, final sound of things that close perfectly, with no play in the hinges, no rattle, no settling. Adiz appeared at my shoulder again. Tier 2 came himself, she said. I know, I said. That's not nothing, I know, I said. The waiting room had grown quiet. Most of the squad was sleeping, or doing the tactical approximation of sleeping that soldiers do. Eyes closed. Brain halfway down, ears still running. A few of them were watching Adiz and me at the window. Private Torsten Haig, who had been in the army longer than almost anyone else in the room, and had the worn, smooth patience of someone who had waited in a great many rooms, was cleaning his nails with the corner of a folded piece of paper he'd found somewhere, which was exactly the kind of small normalizing act that kept a room from tipping, I said to Adiz. They can't close the record. She looked at me. If the record can't be closed, I said, the transfer can't be completed. If the transfer can't be completed, it can't be logged. And if it can't be logged, she was ahead of me. I could see it in the small change in her expression. Not surprise. Just arrival at a destination she'd been traveling toward while I was still giving directions. It didn't happen, she said. I don't know their system well enough to be sure, I said. But everything I've seen about the way they work. If a process can't be closed, process exists in a state of open error. And an open error means the record is incomplete. And an incomplete record means, it means we're not in custody, she said. It means we're not anywhere, I said. Not as far as their records are concerned. The sun had moved. The bright square on the floor had shifted and elongated, and was now a rectangle, inching toward the far wall. Someone was humming. I turned around. Private Torsten Haig, who was still working on his nails with the folded paper, producing a low, unconscious sound. A meandering melodic shape that didn't come from any song I could identify. He wasn't aware he was doing it. The sound just ran out of him the way it ran out of Darren Chalk. Habitual, quiet, the background texture of a person at rest. I sat down on the bench next to him. He glanced at me and didn't say anything. How long have you been doing that? I said. He stopped, looked at me, at his nails. Doing what? He said. Never mind, I said. I closed my eyes and thought about the manifest. About the 4 pages of clean Vithara font, and the one word in my handwriting that didn't belong to any field. I thought about what it would mean for Pethiver 7 to take that to a Tier 3 authority, who would take it to a Tier 4, who would find that the word could not be classified under any existing schema, and would generate what I'd heard the Vithara call a structural query, a question sent back down through the tiers asking for clarification from the originating clerk, who was Osivith 14, who had already escalated because he couldn't provide clarification, which meant the query would arrive back at his terminal unresolvable, which would generate another escalation, which was a loop. The Vithara did not handle loops well. Their system was built on the assumption that every piece of information had a home, that every string of characters pointed to a known category. The space between official designations was empty, was zero, was blank, and blank was fine, blank was acceptable, blank was a field with no data. But a field with data that pointed nowhere was not blank. It was a corruption. It was a record that was simultaneously open and unresolvable, and an unresolvable record was, as far as I understood their administrative architecture, the equivalent of a small fire in a building that was not designed to have fires. I opened my eyes. Adiz was looking at me. What if they just delete it, she said. Strike the notation and reprocess without it. I thought about that. They can't, I said. Once a document has been submitted for processing, any alteration requires authorization from the authorizing party, which is me, and a new submission, which restarts the processing clock and generates an amendment record. And the amendment record would note that a notation was entered and then struck, which would itself require a classification of why the notation was struck. And the only honest answer is that it was struck because it couldn't be classified, and a notation that couldn't be classified appearing in the amendment record of a transfer document would. She held up a hand. I see where this goes. It goes in circles, I said. She looked at the ceiling. The Vithara's clean gray ceiling, unbroken, no seams. Then she looked back at me. And planned this, she said. No, I said. She thought about that for a moment, then she almost smiled. Not the full thing, just the ghost of it. The shape that a smile leaves, when the person doing it doesn't want to commit to the expression in case it attracts attention. Then you're either very lucky or you're smarter than you think you are, she said. I don't know which, I said honestly. It was another 2 hours before Pethavar 7 came back. He brought 3 other Vithara this time. 2 in the collar insignia of Tier 2, classification. 1 in a different clasp I hadn't seen before, angular in a different direction, which I later came to understand was Tier 3. They stood in a row inside the door, and Pethavar 7 held the manifest with both hands again, and there was something different in the way he held himself. The economical Vithara posture was still there. There was a quality to the stillness that was not quite right. A minute tension, like a gear under slightly more load than it was designed for. Sergeant Osi, he said. We have a problem. I know, I said. The notation on entry 19 cannot be resolved under our current classification schema, he said. We have queried 3 tiers of classification authority. None can assign the string Songbird to an existing classification category. This means the document cannot be closed in its current state. I understand, I said. We cannot alter or strike the notation without your authorization, and a new submission would generate an amendment record requiring its own classification resolution, he said. I understand that too, I said. He looked at me. All 4 of them looked at me. You understand, Pethavar 7 said, that this means the transfer cannot be completed. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, the Tier 3 authority, the one with the differently angled clasp, hadn't spoken yet, was looking at me with an attention that was slightly different from the others. Not warmer, exactly. More interested, in the way that a person who has spent a long time with a puzzle looks at someone who has apparently found a novel way to make it worse. You entered this notation intentionally, he said. It was not an error. I entered it because it's true, I said. Darren Chalk is Songbird. That's what the word means on that document. It means he is that to us. Pethavar 7 looked at the manifest. He looked at entry 19, at the word in my handwriting, sitting in the classification field like a stone in a current, untouched, unmoving, deflecting everything that came at it. What you are describing, he said slowly, is a relational designation that exists outside your formal identity architecture. A name that exists between people, in their knowledge of each other, rather than in any official record. Yes, I said, and you placed it in an official record. Yes, because you wished it to be recorded. I didn't answer that immediately. Because the truth was more specific than that, more textured, and I found I wanted to get it right. I'd thought about it for 6 hours by then, and I'd found the real answer, the one under the reflex. Placed it there, I said, because the form asked for a secondary notation, and I had one. He's Songbird. Secondary to his name, but it's not secondary to who he is. Your form asked, I answered. Tier 3 authority made a small sound. Not a word, not quite. A low Vithara vocalization that I'd come to understand as the equivalent of an involuntary pause. Then she said, to Pethavar 7 rather than to me, the field does not specify the notation's required nature. It specifies the notation's required existence. Pethavar 7 didn't look at her. He kept looking at the manifest. That's correct, he said. The form accepted the input, she said. That's also correct, he said. Then the system, she said, accepted a valid submission. The submission's content is the issue, not its form. The content cannot be classified, Pethavar 7 said. No, she said, but it was permitted to enter. There was a long silence between them. A Vithara silence is different from a human silence in that it has no discomfort in it. It's not the silence of people who don't know what to say. It's the silence of people who are each processing the same problem from different angles and haven't reached the same point yet. I waited. The light through the tall glass panels had shifted further into gold. Pethavar 7 was quiet for longer than any Vithara I'd observed had been quiet. The three others behind him were also very still. I'd been in a lot of rooms with the Vithara over 3 years, and I'd never seen 4 of them this still at the same time. It had the quality of a held breath, which was odd, because I wasn't sure the Vithara held their breath in the same way or for the same reasons. Then he said, "This creates a problem that we cannot resolve within our current administrative structure." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry about that." He looked at me with that look. The cataloging look. The reading a barcode look. And this time there was something additional in it that I couldn't quite name. Not quite confusion, because the Vithara didn't read as confused. More like the look of a person who has reached the edge of their map and found the terrain continuing. "You are not sorry," he said. Not as a rebuke. As an observation. I thought about it. "No," I said, "not very." He left again. The 3 other classification authorities left with him. The door closed with that same soft, perfect, no-rattle sound. Adiez and I sat down on the bench. For a long time neither of us said anything. Haig had gone back to his nails. Someone in the far corner was sleeping with a jacket folded under their head. The sun had moved all the way to the far wall and was fading now, losing its directness, going diffuse the way it does in late afternoon when the angle flattens. "What happens now?" Adiez said. "I don't know," I said. "I think they have to make a choice. Either they create a new classification category, which means acknowledging that their schema doesn't contain everything, or they release us under an unresolved processing event, which means we're not technically in their custody. They hold us indefinitely, while they try to resolve something that can't be resolved without making that same acknowledgement." She considered that. "Which one do they do?" she said. "I don't know," I said, "but I know which one costs them least." I was thinking about something I'd noticed over months of Vithara administration. They had many things: efficiency, precision, an administrative architecture so complete it could track every piece of equipment, every personnel unit, every resource flow across a continent. What they didn't have, what their system was not built to accommodate, was incompleteness. An unresolved record was not just an administrative inconvenience, it was an ontological problem. Their system's foundational assumption was that everything that existed could be classified, and a record that couldn't be closed was a record that contained something that, by their own logic, shouldn't exist. Leaving us here in an open processing event was worse for them than releasing us. Because if they left us here, the record stayed open. Every time their system audited its processing events, the amber flag would be there. Osivith 14's caseload would contain an unresolved item. Pethavar 7's escalation log would contain an unresolved query. Tier 3's record would contain it. And none of them could close it without confronting the word in my handwriting that pointed to something their system had no field for. Releasing us didn't solve the problem. But it moved it. It moved it from an active processing event to a closed event with an annotation, released. Administrative error, and an annotation, even an uncomfortable one, was closable. It was a category. Administrative error was a known string. I was right about which choice cost them less. Pethavar 7 came back alone 40 minutes later, and he had a different document, shorter, page. He put it on the counter near the door. There was no counter in the waiting room, so he had to hold it rather than setting it down, which meant he held it with both hands again. And he said, "Sergeant O.C., your group is being released under an administrative error designation. The transfer event will be marked closed with an annotation of processing failure due to document irregularity." I stood up. Behind me, I heard the small sounds of people who had been very still becoming slightly less still, the intake of breath, the controlled shift of weight, the particular quality of attention that comes back into a room when the room understands something has changed. "What happened to the manifest?" I said. "It will be retained in administrative archive with its notation intact," Pethavar 7 said. "It cannot be altered or destroyed once it has entered the processing record. It will remain." I looked at him. "So, his name is in your archive," I said. "Songbird." Pethavar 7's expression did the thing that Vithara expressions did when they were were processing something they didn't have a category for. They held very still, as if motion would constitute an error. "The string is in the archive, yes," he said. "His name," I said. "Songbird." Another long pause. "The string," Pethavar 7 said, "that you have designated as a name." Look at it, and I looked at him and understood that this was the closest he could come to agreement. That was fine. I understood the distance. I've been understanding the distance between what the Vithara meant and what we meant for 3 years. And I was getting good at reading the gap, at knowing when the gap was their limitation, and when it was mine, and when it was simply the space between two things that were built differently, and would remain different regardless of how long they sat across a counter from each other. He had tried to understand it. I believed that. He'd spent more genuine effort on my single penciled word than most imitators in any civilization would have spent on a clerical anomaly. He'd brought Tier 2, brought Tier 3, consulted references I couldn't see, had stood in front of me and engaged seriously with the question of what it meant for a name to exist outside a field. And he'd arrived, correctly, at the conclusion that he couldn't resolve it. Not because he was incapable, but because the gap was real. His system had no architecture for the thing I'd put in the record, and no adjustment to that system could create one without changing what the system fundamentally was. I wondered briefly whether that would happen eventually. Whether at some point the Vithara would add a field. Whether, years from now, some transfer manifest would have a line that said informal designation, or relational alias, or some other careful, technical phrase that was the bureaucratic skin over what we actually meant when we said Songbird. Whether the word would end up classifiable, cataloged, stripped of its refusal to be sorted. I decided I didn't care. The word was in the archive now, unclassified. Whatever came after it, that was true. I signed the release form. Pethavar 7 handed it to me in the same two-handed way he'd held everything. Like documents were things that deserved a certain gravity, a certain formal attention. I appreciated that about the Vithara, even as I understood they were doing it for reasons that had nothing to do with the reasons I would have done it. A daisy was already moving behind me, organizing people in the low-key way she had of doing it. A word here, a gesture there, the gentle, efficient management of 22 people. Standing up and preparing to leave a room without making it look like anything urgent was. Haig was on his feet, jacket squared, exactly as you'd want him. The rest followed. We were out of the building in 12 minutes. The Vithara at the exit checkpoint scanned our IDs against the release form, found everything in order, because the release form was correctly completed and correctly classified, and let us through. Outside, it was late afternoon. The sun was getting low, and the light had gone golden the way it does at that hour, warm and horizontal, laying everything out in long shadows that the Vithara would have disliked. The old street was quieter than I remembered it. The occupation had changed the acoustic texture of the city. Fewer vehicles, fewer voices, a different rhythm in the footsteps of the people you saw. But the light was the same. The light was the same as it had always been, coming down at that angle, making the rough surfaces of the old buildings look deliberate, as if they'd been designed with this exact hour in mind. I stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed the outside air. It smelled like sun-warmed concrete and the particular faint sharpness of the Vithara vehicles in the staging area, a coolant-adjacent smell, slightly metallic, that I'd never been able to fully separate from the occupation's texture in my memory. But underneath it, the city smell, which was the smell of a place where people lived and had been living for a long time. And no administration changed that. You could gut a building and put gray panels on every wall and correct the acoustic properties to favor your processing counters, and the city would still smell like itself in the late afternoon because the smell was in the stones and the streets and the air that moved between the buildings, and those things were older than any record and didn't require classification. Darren Chalk was in the group that had been processed separately. He came out of a different exit and found us on the street, and he had the look he always had when he came out of any Vithara administrative process. A careful blankness, expression of someone who had spent several hours being perfectly unremarkable and was still wearing the effort of it. He found my eye across the group. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing?" I said. Processing delay were clear. He accepted that. He had the practical soldier's relationship to information. You processed what you needed. You let the rest go until it was relevant. He looked around at the street, at the light, at the group around him, and his body did the small adjustment that bodies do when they realize they are no longer in an enclosed space. The slight easing in the shoulders, the breath that goes a little deeper. He rolled his neck once. He looked up at the sky, where the late sun was doing what it was doing, and his expression shifted into something simpler than the careful blankness. Not happiness exactly, but the absence of the effort to be unremarkable. The face underneath the face he wore in their rooms. And then, because he couldn't help it, because it was his nature, he started humming. Not a song, just a shape, a meandering melodic shape that went up slightly and then came back around, brief and unconscious, the kind of sound that runs ahead of thought. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped, the way it always stopped. Without resolution, without his noticing, it had started. A daze caught my eye. I looked away before either of us could react. We walked. The city had changed, and the light had not. And the sound of 23 people moving together on an old street had the particular texture of people who knew which direction to go without being told. I thought about Pethavar 7's archive, about the manifest that was sitting in it now, filed under processing failure, document irregularity, about entry 19 with its clean official fields, the name, the number, the rank, the rating, the skill cluster, and in the notation field, in my handwriting, the word that couldn't be classified. Songbird. Their archive would hold it. That was one of the things the Vethera were genuinely excellent at, holding things, preserving records with a fidelity that their own administrators called inevitable, meaning it was not possible for a record, once entered, to degrade or be lost, or to become something other than what it was. 100 years from now, assuming their administration persisted, the record would be exactly as I'd submitted it. The official fields would all say what they said, and in the notation column, tick, the word would still be there, pointing at nothing their system could reach, meaning something their categories couldn't hold, belonging to no classification they'd ever devised. I thought about that for a while as we walked, and I decided I was glad of it. Not for strategic reasons. By then the strategy was done, had resolved itself, had been folded back into history. Just as a fact, the way certain facts feel solid and worth carrying. Durin Chalk, 881 Foxtrot 447, private first class, and also Songbird. Both things true. Both things his. One of them in their records now. Unchanged, unclassifiable, permanent. Long after either of us was gone. Long after this street was changed again. Long after the gray composite panels were stripped out or left in or repurposed for something else. That would still be there. In a language they'd built to contain everything. In a field designed for formal designations. The word in my handwriting. That meant nothing to their system and everything to 22 people who'd spent 8 months listening to a 19-year-old hum. The street came to an intersection, and I turned right, because right was the direction we needed, and the squad turned with me, and behind me I could hear Haig's boots on the old pavement. He walked with a slight heel strike, distinctive, something I'd learned to track without thinking. And ahead the city opened up a little, the buildings set further back, the late light and doing what late light does, which is make everything look briefly like itself, the specific color and texture of each surface, before the evening takes it. The Vethera would process the next transfer tomorrow, and the one after that. They were very good at processing. They had been doing it for 3 years, and they were getting better at it. More efficient. Precise. The gap between submission and completion, narrowing month by month as they learned our paperwork habits and adjusted their schemas to account for them. They were studying us the way they studied everything, methodically, carefully, the patient accumulating precision of a civilization that believed everything could eventually be sorted and filed. Everything, except the things that lived in the spaces between the official fields, the things that only existed because one person noticed them about another person and said so, quietly, without a form to put it on, and the name stuck. The things that ran ahead of classification like sound runs ahead of the instrument making it. Already in the air, already changing the air before anyone has decided what to call it. Darren Chalk was humming again. He didn't know he'd stopped and started. It was the same shape as before, the same small melodic arc, and it ran out into the late afternoon with the same quality it always had. Quiet, tenuous, entirely itself. I didn't say anything. I just listened for the few seconds it lasted, and then it was gone and we kept walking. Shh. And the light held on a little longer the way it does when you're not paying attention to it, and then it didn't.